Hey everyone, this is chapter 1 of the first part of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World. This part is titled The Nature of the Soviet State. It was in 1917 and towards the end of October, according to the Russian calendar, that there occurred a great political event whose date engraved itself ineradicably on the text of history. The proletariat of St. Petersburg and Moscow, led by the Bolshevik party, took hold of power. Two leaders rose up as giants in this great historical event: Lenin, the incomparable master of the revolutionary movement, and Trotsky, the spirit of proletariat insurrection. The world in its fury stopped its work of destruction for a moment and cast an astonished and incredulous gaze on the infinite plains of Russia. Above the snows rose a red flag decorated with a hammer and sickle. But after this moment of perplexity, men turned away again, as much as to say, quote, "We'll see later," end quote, and resumed their slaughter. A breath of hope passed over the impoverished and ravaged masses. In the midst of all the violence and obscurantism, a light had shone very high up. It had meaning for all these wretches. Quote, "Light comes from the east," end quote. This was the new word. Capital W word. For the second time in history, the brutalized and indifferent masses raised their heads from their immediate needs and scanned the horizon, sniffing the wind like beasts of prey coming out of their lair. It seemed to them that the wind was good and that the favorable moment had arrived. 140 years previously, these masses had been awakened by the cannonade of Valmy, and even the Montagnards, armed with the pikes and axes, descended from their distant valleys. Wikipedia says the Battle of Valmy, also known as Cannonade of Valmy, was the first major victory by the army of France during the Revolutionary Wars that followed the French Revolution. The Battle of Valmy took place on the 20th of September 1792 as Prussian troops commanded by the Duke of Brunswick attempted to march on Paris. Generals Francois Kellerman and Charles de Mouriez stopped the advance near the northern village of Valmy in Champagne-Ardenne. In this early part of the Revolutionary Wars, known as the War of the First Coalition, the new French government was in almost every way unproven, and thus the small localized victory at Valmy became a huge psychological victory for the revolution at large. The outcome was thoroughly unexpected by contemporary outsiders, a vindication for the French revolutionaries, and a stunning defeat for the vaunted Prussian army. The victory emboldened the newly assembled National Convention to formally declare the end of monarchy in France and to establish the French Republic. Valmy permitted the development of the revolution and all its resultant ripple effects, and for that it is regarded by historians as one of the most significant battles in history. So that's Valmy. So, back to the text. 140 years previously, these masses had been awakened by the cannonade of Valmy, and even the Montagnards, armed with pikes and axes, descended from their distant valleys. Footnote: on the 20th of September 1792, the French under General de Mouriez halted the Prussian invasion at Valmy, near the forest of Argonne. The French forces were stiffened by revolutionary volunteers after a devastating cannonade against the Prussians, drove them back to cries of, quote, "Vive la Nation." The battle cry was regarded as a turning point in the revolutionary defense of France. The Montagnard usually refers to the Jacobin deputies in the convention selected in September 1792, they occupied the high seats or, quote, mountain, end quote, end parenthesis. They occupied the high seats or, quote, mountain, end quote, end parenthesis. Rizzi, however, uses the term in the sense closer to the sans-culotte. End footnote. am I? But at the mouths of the valleys they saw white clouds rising in the plain. Then he rained a fire on their ranks. It was the cannons of the Third Estate welcoming them. The good Montagnard had been mistaken. They turned and went back to their valleys, whence they had come with an age-long hope suddenly aroused. The Montagnards acted wisely. They knew that their time had not yet come, and took refuge in their mountains for a further long wait. But this time the Montagnards did not stop where the valleys meet the plain. They met no artillery barrage from the bourgeoisie, but spread themselves as masters on the owners' fields. The workers' and peasants' state was proclaimed. From the Kremlin's towers the signal of revolution spread in waves, and Red Guards bivouacked in the palace courtyards of Ivan the Terrible. Bivouac means like if you didn't know, I learned this recently because I'm used to thinking of. So I remember one time I was like into camping and I wanted to buy like a bivy sack. I was like, what the hell does bivy stand for? Bivouac is kind of like a tentless sleeping ground. Sorry, it's like when if you're just like sleeping out, sort of like sleeping out under the stars, but like without like a shelter. Yeah. It's more sophisticated than just falling asleep wherever you are, but it's like soldiers and shit do it sometimes. And the Red Guards bivouacked in the palace courtyards of Ivan the Terrible. The people from the most downtrodden layers, wakened from their centuries-long slumber, left their slums, flaunted their rags in the main streets of the great towns, and brought to them the atmosphere of revolution. A rising swell lasting 3 or 4 years almost broke through the powerful dikes of capitalism, when the waters ebbed gurgling. From time to time the waters, so to speak, surged in waves coming from far off, like those produced by the passage of a steamer, not waves from the movement of the sea itself. Thus either the potential force of this rising revolutionary swell was not rightly used, or else the force was not put to work. In effect, the technicians of revolution, even where they knew how to transform this potential force into energy, then found it isolated and powerless, since the level of the waters had fallen all around them. The opportunism of the workers' parties in the West isolated the revolution in Russia, like an oasis in the desert, so that it was no longer a question of socialism, that is to say, of the international proletarian economy. However, neither can... Come on. Neither can one speak of capitalism as far as the nature of the so-called Soviet state is concerned. So what is it? That is the question. The Russian Revolution took place more than 20 years ago, and it is strange that nobody has so far applied themselves to studying the social results of this great historic event. The USSR provides the subject of its discussions, commentaries, accounts. Its supporters and its adversaries always speak from a political point of view, but they have always neglected the social point of view. However, after 20 years, do we not believe that it is still possible to consider the Russian Revolution as being in a period of transition and transformation? However, after 20 years, we do not believe that it is still possible to consider the Russian Revolution as being in a period of transition and transformation. It must have produced positive results, already fixed in a social crystallization. Some have seen in the Russian Revolution, quote, the empire of forced labor, end quote, or, quote, the revolution betrayed, end quote. Others have described it as, quote, the triumph of fascism, end quote, and yet others as, quote, the land of the great lie, end quote. Some sigh over the, quote, destiny of a revolution. Others weigh up the, quote, balance of communism, end quote. Writers of all political gradations, from communist to fascist, passing through the center parties, have written works of real merit, both for their arguments and their documentation. Scholars have interested themselves in the subject and have visited the country to make their own observations. French, German, and American workers have gone enthusiastically to the country where they supposed their social hopes to be realized. They have returned with their hearts saddened, their souls poisoned, and have left us an objective, practical, highly interesting testimony on life, work, and liberty in the land of the Soviets. All this enormous volume of publications does not treat at all the social crystallization that has taken place in the USSR, still less does it offer us conclusion. Doubtless there are here and there allusions in it, but without direct impact. They are the result of polemic rather than of systematic sociological research. Trotsky himself, whom we consider to have the most profound knowledge of the present conditions and the evolution of the Soviet state, uses 9 paragraphs in the attempt to give a definition of this state. What has so far been lacking is a panoramic view of the whole, a synthesis, a crystallized representation of what the USSR is from the social point of view. We ourselves, 2 years ago, in our modest work, Where is the USSR Going? Bracket, Rizzi, 1937, end bracket, did not succeed in providing an answer. The question mark was there precisely to ask what we ourselves were asking. But if we did not succeed in giving an answer, we did at least ask the question. In 1938, our minds stopped searching since we had managed to solve the problem. What was happening on the social plane of other countries confirmed that which we had come to consider as formed in the social structure of the Soviet state. Given that the world is now reduced to a single form of civilization, capitalism, it follows that the social transformation of any state is of extreme interest to the rest of our planet, since it is in this precocious local transformation that the world can see the reflected image of its own future social form. The USSR has been spoken of in all terms. The press and speech makers have artificially obscured the problem instead of making it more clear. The greatest idiocies have been uttered. There has also been evidence of the greatest cowardice. In reality, the social phenomenon was difficult to understand, particularly on the part of those journalists who visited Russia and who knew little or nothing of Marx, Lenin, and their theories. Moreover, the social phenomenon that was taking shape had to begin with a communist direction. Then the halt of the proletarian revolution in the rest of the world produced a degeneration which in recent years fixed its forms within the social order. Today, the social structure of the Soviet state has taken on clear lines, almost complete. We, at least, recognize these lines as they are, even as specialists of the problem insist on a different theory. These specialists, reduced to a small number, are to be found in the groups of revolutionaries who have abandoned the Third International, considering that it has now for a long time definitely passed to opportunist terrain. These specialists have arrived at the question of the nature of the Soviet state, and only as a result of debates, within their political factions, on the tactics and strategy of proletarian revolution. They did not suppose there could possibly be a crystallized social form, intermediate between capitalism and socialism, but in the crucible of their polemics the problem of such a crystallization was categorically posed, and it sustains the doctrinal differences which underlie the political impotence of these specialists. What is the USSR today? To begin with, we shall be deliberately imprecise in our diagnosis of this society, only later shall we go on to greater precision. First of all, we want to focus on that which is universally agreed. Certainly, it is not a democratic state, but a totalitarian state. Its economy is not capitalist. It is not based on private property, but collective property and the means of production. From Citrine to Trotsky and from Roosevelt to Mussolini, it is admitted in a general way that the Soviet economy is not socialist. Only Stalin is of a different opinion, and with good reason. Consequently, we shall not attach much importance to Stalin's view on this. Writers by the dozen have dealt with Stalin's socialism in Stalin's constitution, the, quote, most democratic in the world, end quote. Stalin, for Stalin's part, does not flinch and naturally forbids these publications in the land of the, quote, good life, end quote. The, quote, most democratic in the world, end quote. There is another undoubted feature recorded by Trotsky, Citrine, Victor Serge, and Siliga, and a host of writers of various nationalities and political outlooks. In no capitalist or fascist country does the working class experience such sorry conditions as those of the proletariat in Soviet Russia. Footnote. Sir Walter Citrin's I Search for Truth in Russia, on which Rizzi draws on several points below, was first published in 1936. Anti-Siliga, à paix du grand mensonge, was published in 1938, which I think is the Russian Enigma. And Victor Serge introduced numerous articles after his release from the Soviet Union in 1936. End footnote. Where was I? There's another undoubted feature recorded by Trotsky, Citrin, Victor Serge, Siliga, and a host of writers of various nationalities and political outlooks. In no capitalist or fascist country does the working class experience such sorry conditions as those of the proletariat in Soviet Russia. There's no freedom of speech, of assembly, or of the press. Informing is common, and the regime is above all that of a police state. All writers are agreed on this. Exploitation of man by man still exists in the land of the, quote, good life, end quote, and takes the form of the same surplus value that the capitalists extract from the workers. Parenthesis, differences appear only when it is a question of identifying those exploiters individually, end parenthesis. It's very interesting, the use of the word surplus value. Not surplus product, but surplus value, which is, and the Marxists will just tell you that surplus value is something distinct from surplus product. And the use of the word surplus value here is theoretically significant. All writers are agreed on this. Exploitation of man by man still exists in the land of the, quote, good life, end quote, and takes the form of the same surplus value that the capitalists extract from the workers. Parenthesis, differences appear only when it is a question of identifying the exploiters individually, end parenthesis. Another characteristic aspect which should not be neglected is that the state expresses itself in a grand theatrical manner, as in the Western totalitarian states, and the real or feigned veneration of the leader, raised almost to divinity, is equal or perhaps even greater. The hierarchy is held in great esteem, and servility is pushed to its ultimate limit. The population lives in an atmosphere of fear. As though walls could hear and speak, people assume a public face quite different from what they feel individually. These facts being granted in general terms, and completed by the differences we have pointed to, the political and social physiognomy of the Soviet state emerges in a more defined way, and it's this physiognomy that we propose to explain to the reader. The primary aim of the October Revolution was to act as a lever for the revolution in the West. However, at the same time, steps were taken towards a socialist economy. Fundamentally, private property in land and large industrial enterprises was abolished. The economic management of this property passed from the hands of the defeated bourgeoisie into those of the triumphant proletariat. A social transformation in the USSR had to begin from economic conditions that were certainly not the most favorable. In effect, the country was basically formed of laborers and illiterates, its industry being far inferior to the requirements of an advanced economy. If the Bolsheviks, as soon as the Bolsheviks took power, immediately used the radio to call upon other working classes to follow their example, it was because they understood that they were faced with the need to join the Western nations, developed from the point of view of technique in having a large and cultivated working class, to the Russian Revolution. Otherwise, this revolution was doomed to social and economic defeat, even if her military resistance succeeded heroically in repelling the assaults of the Old World. The German working class was the natural ally of the Bolshevik Revolution. The German working class's bourgeoisie, coming out of the war defeated and broken, offered it the power almost without a blow. Apart from the Spartacist outbreaks and the sacrifice of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the German working class passed without honor from defeat to defeat. In 1923, the German working class was offered power again, but the proletariat deserted the field without a struggle, even abandoning it to the Hitlerite gangs. Was this the fault of the leaders of the Third International? No, it was the fault of all together, including the German proletariat, too cold, too much attached to order, and of a non-revolutionary character. 50 years previously, the workers of Paris had proclaimed the Commune, after the defeat of the French bourgeoisie in 1870, and 100,000 of them, who fought with only the slenderest hope and in unready economic circumstances, went to their deaths on the ramparts of Paris. Messieurs the Marxists, who are concerned solely with the economy and judge politics only by statistics, may well get angry, but we assert that the unrevolutionary spirit of the German working class had much to do with this defeat of the European and world working class. By the same token, the clearly revolutionary temper of the Russian proletariat had much to do with the victory of October. The German people had never made a revolution. In its political development, it has always followed other nations. But a century or more behind, France, on the contrary, has always given its blood for the whole world. It is certainly economic conditions that are the real necessary conditions on which the possibility of a social transformation depends. But once these conditions exist and have ripened, the success of revolution is but a question of revolutionary spirit. As far as those who must do the fighting are concerned, and of revolutionary capacity as far as the leaders are concerned. Let the Marxists explain, if they can, the defeat of the European proletariat according to historical materialism as this is understood by the orthodox. Was not the German economy ultra-ripe for the transition? To conclude, and in order not to repeat what has been said in 1,000 ways, we assert that following the defeat of the German and European working-class revolution, the dictatorship of the Russian proletariat found itself isolated in a hostile capitalist world. The ebb of the revolutionary wave was general, this wave which immediately after the war terrified the bourgeoisie. It followed that, for any acute observer, revolutionary perspectives were postponed to the Greek kalends. In the meantime, capitalism regained its breath and production grew until 1929, this being particularly due to repairs of war damage and the rebuilding of stocks. The Russian Revolution was faced with a choice, either to get by while waiting for the revolution in Western Europe, or to come to an agreement with the external world and consequently change internal policies. The second solution was chosen. Stalin was first of all its advocate and then its pitiless executor. This radical change of policy had naturally to be hidden, at least in external terms, both from the Russian proletariat and the working classes of all other nations. This was not particularly difficult, since for almost 100 years the workers had been systematically duped by the, quote, Reds, end quote, of all parties and of all shades who had appeared on the political scene. The Russian working class and the workers of other nations absorbed this enormous deception too, and gave all too few signs of anger against their leaders, real traitors. One would say that these workers had got into the habit or had become accustomed to mystification. Lenin being dead, a successor was needed. Trotsky stood out as the most worthy figure from both the moral and the intellectual points of view. Trotsky's revolutionary honesty and his ability would certainly have served very well to defend the first sole workers' state in the world, but Trotsky was put on the scrap heap. Trotsky was unanimously ostracized and boycotted by the epigons of the revolution. Those who knew something of socialist and communist parties will not be at all surprised at such a thing. Trotsky stood out as a giant in Lenin's entourage, so they were well advised to neutralize Trotsky and put aside a great obstacle that would have interfered with the national and international campaign of brainwashing. The reality is still this. The real dictatorship was that of the Bolshevik Party and not of the proletariat, a dictatorship which was located in the party cells and not in the Soviets. It thus came to pass that the Bolshevik Party, the only one that had not betrayed the workers before the revolution, betrayed them once it had achieved victory, that is to say, when it thought there were no further dangers. The theoreticians of dictatorship over the proletariat, who conceived, so to speak, the Bolshevik Party as a guide within the democratic regime of the Soviets, have in effect conceived it as holding a monopoly of proletarian social leadership. These theoreticians have lent themselves to a bureaucratic degeneration much helped by the conjunction of circumstances. Thus these men who enjoyed the confidence of the proletariat dispossessed the proletariat, just as it was dispossessed by those who led it to battle and to victory, and above all by those who formed the great mass of parvenus. A political party cannot hope to act as a dictator with a vast social program while seeking participation and control by all workers. the only guarantee is the proletarian class, with all the power in the Soviets. Various writers have given accounts of all that has happened since the death of Lenin, but our interest lies in focusing on the end results. The functionaries of the state and of the Bolshevik Party in socializing the land and industrializing the country further and further undermined the powers of workers and ended up having a monopoly over the state. In doing this, they had to ally with the technicians whom they could not do without. Thus, there was realized in Russia the first great fusion in the process of formation of the new ruling class. The Stakhanovite campaign is an expression of this, and at the same time it is also a new method for spurring on the masses of workers to greater productivity. Other fusions followed with the toadies of the regime, and through the purchase of high positions in the army and parastate bureaucracy. We are thus at a point where economic and political control is monopolized by the bureaucracy, and the new constitution sanctions this. Within this bureaucracy, there is a division of labor, which as a whole has as its goal maintaining political dominance and economic privileges. The bureaucrats with their families form a mass of about 15 million inhabitants. There are enough of them to form a class, and since Trotsky assures us that 40% of production is taken by the bureaucracy, we can also say that this class is privileged! It is all-powerful, this class, since it has the economic levers in its hands, protected by a police state set up for this purpose. It fixes as it sees best both wages and retail prices, with markups over cost price, in comparison with which earlier bourgeois, quote, bloodsuckers, end quote, would appear to us as, quote, honest traders, end quote. The little information that we have allows us to assert that the margins over cost price of basic necessities are 2 or 3 times greater than the markups used in the despised capitalist countries. Is that is this in reference to the turnover tax or whatever? There's a really high taxation, I think, on consumer goods in the Soviet Union in this period, which was not so for capital goods. But I'm not sure about the nature of luxury goods. Back to the text. Where am I? Citrine provides us with incontrovertible evidence. It sometimes happens that the bureaucrats buy wheat from the peasants at a low price and then resell the wheat to the workers at a price 10 times larger. The economic plan is naturally a matter of close concern to the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy's provisions are logically those which are the most profitable to the new class. The Soviet press itself documents the miserable conditions of the houses of its workers, who have on average 5 square meters per inhabitant. Well! Instead of building new workers' houses, and only these, for which there is the greatest need, they prefer, for example, the construction of the, quote, Palace of Soviets, end quote, 360 meters high, since it is not in reality the Palace of the Soviets, but that of the Soviet bureaucracy. Wikipedia says, the Palace of the Soviets was a project to construct a political convention center in Moscow on the site of the demolished Cathedral of Christ the Savior. The main function of this palace was to house sessions of the Supreme Soviet in its 130-meter (430 foot) wide and 100-meter (330 foot) tall Grand Hall seating over 20,000 people. If built, the 416-meter (1,365 foot) tall palace would have become the world's tallest structure, with an internal volume surpassing the combined volumes of the 6 tallest American skyscrapers. This was especially important for the Soviet state for propaganda purposes. Boris Yeltsin's victory in a series of 4 architectural competitions held between 1931 and 1933 signaled a sharp turn in Soviet architecture, from radical modernism to the monumental historicism that would come to characterize Stalinist architecture. The definite design of Yeltsin, Vladimir Shuko, and Vladimir Helfrich was conceived in 1933-34 and took its final shape in 1937. The staggered stack of ribbed cylinders, crowned with a 100-meter (330-foot) statue of Vladimir Lenin, blended Art Deco and neoclassical influence with contemporary American skyscraper technology. Work on the site commenced in 1933. The foundation was completed in January 1939. The German invasion of June 1941 ended the project. Engineers and workers were diverted to defense projects or pressured into the army. The installed structural steel was disassembled in 1942 for fortifications and bridges. After World War II, Joseph Stalin lost interest in the palace. Yvan produced several revised, scaled-down designs but failed to reanimate the project. The alternative palace of the Soviets in Sparrow Hills, which was proposed after Stalin's death, did not proceed beyond the architectural competition stage. Very interesting. Back to the text. Instead of building new workers' houses and only these, for which there is the greatest need, they prefer, for example, the construction of the, quote, Palace of Soviets, end quote, 360 meters high, since it is not in reality the palace of the Soviets, but that of the Soviet bureaucracy. Footnote. An account of the design and planning of the Moscow Palace of the Soviets during the 1930s is in Cunliffe, 1979, end parenthesis. It was, however, never built, and the project was abandoned after the foundations had been prepared following the German attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941. End footnote. If one asks for justification of this use of public money, the bureaucrat invariably replies that the workers have raised no objection, as if the workers of the USSR were allowed to give their advice or oppose the wishes of their masters. Among the bureaucrats, functionaries, technicians, policemen, officers, journalists, writers, trade unions, and finally the whole Communist Party en bloc, such solidarity has been established that all problems are blamed on the workers, tied like slaves to the economic machine of the state, a machine which the bureaucrats, in an excess of irony, describe as an organ of the working class. If the functionaries administer, the technicians represent what one may call confidence men. The police is charged with guarding the new property and keeping the conduct of citizens in accord with the political lines set up by the top of the hierarchy. Journalists and writers are given the responsibility of, quote, scientifically, end quote, deceiving the public as a whole. The trade union mandarins have become real functionaries, placed among the workers to keep their finger on their pulse and dupe them, just as is done and has always been done in all workers' organizations, yellow or red, in all the capitalist countries. Between the trade union bureaucracies in the Soviet Union and those in America, Britain, or France, there is little difference as far as goals are concerned. There is, however, a considerable difference of substance in that, while the trade union bureaucracies of the capitalist countries are in the service of the bourgeoisie, in the Soviet state this bureaucracy is in the service of a bureaucratic state, and thus in the service of itself. The Russian Communist Party has become the prey of the bureaucrats, and within it, workers are hardly represented anymore. The party is nothing more than the dog keeping the sheep in order. Stalin, who came later, is the, quote, great shepherd, end quote, his crook on his shoulders and his bag strapped to his cartridge belt. If a sheep strays from the ranks, the dog barks and Stalin gives a blow with his crook. The flock takes note, increasingly fears the dog, and addresses its plaintive bleatings to the, quote, great shepherd, end quote. The proletariat has only the right to work in those enterprises whose property is derisively ascribed to it, but it has no managing role. It can only shed blood and sweat, since the proletariat is goaded by systems that have nothing socialist about them, but are even worse than the systems current in capitalist countries, which are held in such contempt. This sketch is not our invention, but rather the conclusion drawn from the accounts of, quote, specialists, end quote, on the question, whose arguments we take up below. One can see clearly from this sketch that socialism counts for nothing in this society. All the world is agreed on this point, apart, of course, from Stalin and the Soviet bureaucracy. The central argument of Trotsky and co. and the whole gradation of revolutionary sects opposed to the Third International goes as follows. Property and the means of production has been socialized and the economy is planned. According to Trotsky, despite all the rest, the Soviet state remains a worker state and the dictatorship of the proletariat is still in force. Exclamation point. We shall deal with this question below. For the present, we only wish to show, with the help of common sense, the nature of the Soviet state, and then we shall go on to examine the Soviet state's, quote, scientific, end quote, arrangements. In our sense, a new ruling class, the bureaucracy, is issued from the October Revolution and its retreat, while the bourgeoisie has been dispatched and as a result has no possibility of returning. Possession of the state gives the bureaucracy possession of all those goods which, despite being socialized, do not belong any the less to the new ruling class. It goes without saying that the new class is careful not to declare officially that it does possess this property, but, in effect, it has in its hands all the economic levers and it guards its property with the GPU and the bayonets of a, quote, purged, end quote, army. Every factory has its GPU contingent to guard it. And in the large enterprises there is even a soldier of the regular army, who stands guard with his bayonet fixed. He controls those who enter, examines documents, and follows the visitor around, even if it is a figure of substance such as the trade unionist Walter Citrine. The Soviet state, rather than becoming socialized, is becoming bureaucratized. Instead of gradually dissolving into a society without classes, it is growing immeasurably. 15 million individuals are already attached to the trunk of the state and drink its sap. They exploit the working class en bloc, in a manner corresponding to the transformation of property. The bureaucratic class exploits the working class and fixes its standard of living by means of wages and by the price set for goods in the state shops. The new ruling class has purchased, en bloc, the proletariat. The workers have not even been left the freedom to offer their, quote, labor power, end quote, to different entrepreneurs. The bureaucracy has given itself a monopoly position, thus perfecting the system of exploitation. The Russian proletarians have been laid low. This new formed society resolves, from a social point of view, the insupportable antagonism that made capitalist society incapable of all progress. In capitalist society, the form of production has been collective for a long time, since everybody is involved, in a direct or indirect manner, in the production of goods. But the property in goods is individual precisely as a consequence of maintaining private property. In socializing property and putting property effectively under the control of one class, acting in unison, the antagonism within the system of production of capitalist society is removed, and a new system replaces it. At the beginning, this system exploits workers savagely as capitalism did at one time. As the system strengthens and perfects itself, production grows, and it can happen that the ruling class has the possibility to distribute a large share to those it is exploiting. In an international and normal context, the development of production on collectivist bases, while passing into the control of the bureaucracy, should certainly take place, since one would thereby eliminate or reduce by a great deal the enormous expenditures for arms that are nowadays being made everywhere. Yet armaments are still developing and states are being transformed into fundamentally military organisms. This enormous waste of labor can easily neutralize or reverse the extra impulse that production undeniably receives as a result of the collectivization of property and the organization of the economy according to pre-established plan. The new social system appears in the development of humanity's history as a parasitic phenomenon. Power should logically have passed from the bourgeoisie to the proletariat, but that has not happened, clearly because of the proletariat's political immaturity. In effect, we have passed to a form of social control that is neither bourgeois nor proletarian. The figure of the capitalist bourgeois has become superfluous within the large-scale production and is automatically removed. The former official, the clerk of the bourgeoisie, takes on a juridical form by allying himself with the trade union bureaucracy and the totalitarian state. A new class appears on the horizon. Only the near future can tell us if this new class, showing throughout the world, is able, first of all, to level all the differences that imperialism has left, and thereafter to increase the volume of production by using the new economic and political organization. We shall also see if this class is able to improve the masses' conditions of life. It is that which will put its, quote, virtuosity, end quote, to the test. Political symptoms accord with the dawning bureaucratization of the world. Munich is only the first coming together of bureaucratic consciousness. The capitalists and the representatives of the new regimes, after having pushed each other to the brink of the abyss, suddenly came to agreement. Certainly they were spurred to it by presentiments of the social future. The old imperialisms, the French, the English, the American, taking note that it is useless and impossible to maintain their hegemony in a world which, if it wishes to survive, can no longer be imperialist and is becoming more bureaucratic before their eyes. The old democracies are playing the role of anti-fascists in order not to waken the, quote, sleeping dog, end quote. The workers must be kept dormant while they sleep. Social transformation comes about silently in their countries. At the same time, at every possible moment, the old democracies feed anti-fascism to the working classes. It is due to them, these democracies, that Spain has become, while they sleep, a veritable butcher shop for proletarians of all nations. This in order both to slake the workers' revolutionary appetites and dispose of the products of heavy industry. In China, workers are pushed towards an anti-Japanese policy beneath the leadership of the famous Chiang Kai-shek, who still has his hands stained with blood of the flower of the Chinese proletariat. It goes without saying that, on this occasion too, the workers swallow everything and wait in line, knowing nothing, almost resigned. Little by little, the workers of France, of Britain, and of America will lose their qualities as citizens. They will become but the, quote, subjects, end quote, of a bureaucratic regime which will nationalize property and take many other measures under a, quote, socialist, end quote, trademark. The regime will not call itself fascism or National Socialism. It will certainly have another name, but the basis will still be the same. That is to say, collective property in the hands of the state, with the bureaucracy as the ruling class, the collective and planned organization of production, and finally the exploitation of the worker, passing from the level of the individual to that of the class. This is like an example, and this, I think, I'm not sure, I haven't read The Managerial Revolution, but this is like an important thing in like the field of like Soviet studies, especially talking about like Marxist interpretations of the USSR, the degree to which people, to which different theorists subscribe to some form of like convergence theory. They think like that nationalization, like they say like the Stalinist social patterns and or fascist social patterns, and the degree to which they're similar or different is an important topic, but also the degree to which like Stalinism will be an isolated phenomenon, right? The degree to which Stalinism will is something specific. Stalinism obviously has a very specific name. It's a reference to a man, and the social developments associated with that man. But the question of whether this bureaucratic collectivist society will become something universal or not. Different people have different degrees of convergence theory, different interpretations of what they think the overall tendency of the relationship between state and economy will be in the future. Anyway. At this point, the Marxist Trotsky shouts his head off that not only the conditions of distribution but also those of production are not socialist, contrary to what he has explained to us on the subject of Russia. Then he will go further and make revolutionary propaganda against the bureaucracy of the whole world! Exclamation point. The hardening of this bureaucracy represents, according to Trotsky, quote, a historical possibility and not an accomplished fact, end quote. We must thus wait until the facts come about for Trotsky to be able to analyze them. Only then should one speak to the proletariat, which would already be ruled by bureaucratic governments. Imagine the result. Trotsky's analysis may be very scientific and 100% Marxist, but it will come too late if there is no longer any possible outcome. If there is no longer any other possible outcome. It might even persuade the bureaucratic leaders who would content themselves, by way of reply to him, with the fascist expression, "Je me if..." I don't fucking know. ... end quote. Let's see if anything comes up. don't know, not seeing anything. Where am I? The accomplished fact exists in Russia and must be understood. It is in the process of coming about and is visible in Italy as in Germany. The first indicators of it appear everywhere, even in the great democracies. There is one more card that Trotsky in particular could play, but we are certain that Trotsky has no wish to play it. Trotsky's great figure declines slowly in a gray sky, and at the same time the recollection of a bright day fades, obliterated by the dusk. Yoffe, before committing suicide, wrote Trotsky a letter and urged him not to fear isolation so long as he kept true to the Leninist line. This seems to refer to Adolf Yoffe. Wikipedia says he lived from 1883 to 1927 and was a Russian revolutionary, a Bolshevik politician, and a Soviet diplomat of Karaite descent. It has a whole biography of him. I'm going to skip to the part about looks like it has a bit about his opposition and suicide. Yoffe remained a friend and loyal supporter of Leon Trotsky through the 1920s, joining Trotsky in the left opposition. By late 1927, Yoffe was gravely ill, in extreme pain, and confined to his bed. After a refusal by the Stalinist leadership of the Communist Party to send him abroad for treatment and Trotsky's expulsion from the Communist Party on the 12th of November 1927, he committed suicide on the 16th of November. He left a farewell letter addressed to Trotsky, but the letter was seized by Soviet secret police agents and later quoted by Stalinists to discredit both Yoffe and Trotsky. Trotsky's eulogy at Yoffe's funeral was his last public speech in the Soviet Union. Yoffe's wife, Marie Yoffe, was arrested as a left oppositionist Trotskyist by Stalin's security forces, yet Maria Yoffe survived to write her memoirs, One Long Night, A Tale of Truth. Yoffe's daughter, Nadezhda Yoffe, also an active Trotskyist, survived Stalin's prisons and labor camps and published a memoir, Back in Time, My Life, My Fate, My Epoch. These all sound very interesting. Where am I? Footnote. Back to the text footnote. Yoffe's letter and suicide in November 1927 are recounted in Deutscher. End footnote. It seems to us that Trotsky has followed this advice too literally. He has certainly not followed it in Lenin's way. At the time of the split in the Russian Social Democratic Party, when Plekhanov was thrown out of the window, Lenin several times pleaded with Trotsky to remain with him. Footnote. The reference is to the split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democrats in 1903. Rizzi, however, is slightly inexact. Plekhanov supported Lenin during and for a short time after the Congress. End footnote. Lenin did not succeed, but when in 1917 Leon Trotsky returned to St. Petersburg and recognized that he had been mistaken, Lenin welcomed Trotsky to the Bolshevik ranks, since he understood that a political mistake is not treason. Trotsky, on the contrary, has cut off all communication with those who are not of his way of thinking. Trotsky has enrolled in his school young people who follow the, quote, line, end quote, according to his own systems. The Danton of the October Revolution never imagines that he could be wrong. Trotsky is too sure of himself. This is a good thing up to a certain point, but it is a real weakness when argument relies on doubtful polemical methods. This indicates that one does not have enough confidence in one's own resources. What it should do is stimulate one to take account of others' thinking and recognize one's mistakes without fear, since any other solution will lead to far worse results. In our sense, the USSR represents a new type of society ruled by a new social class. That is our conclusion. Property, collectivized, effectively belongs to this class, which has installed a new and superior system of production. Or keep that in mind, superior. That's another big important question in theories of the USSR, is like the degree to which the system could be called progressive or inferior. Progressive based upon what criteria? Usually progressive in the sense of like developing the productive forces, not in the sense of like the social content of that development. Exploitation passes from the level of the individual to that of the class. The many political struggles that have taken place in the USSR since 1923 are so many battles on the part of this new class in the process of formation against the working class. It is not important if, at the beginning, these struggles do not have a well-defined goal. The slaughter of the Leninist old guard and of all those who could give offense to the bureaucracy, which has been the delight of the Soviet Union since the death of Kirov, is nothing but the civil war necessary for the new class to strengthen its power. It is not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of strength on the part of this class. For a long time, the USSR has abandoned all revolutionary intentions and has fallen at the feet of the Franco-British bourgeoisie. The capitalists know that in Russia today there exists nothing but an appearance of revolution and socialism for simpletons. That is why the capitalists have invited and accepted the Soviet Union even in their sanctuary in Geneva. These capitalists do nothing but protest against the common terms revolutionary gestures, but they do it only in order the better to dupe the workers. What are important are the facts, which tell us that as of now, and for several years past, the USSR has been coupled to the bourgeois train. In effect, Paris, London, and New York have clearly recognized a state that is an exploiter and oppressor of workers in the so-called Soviet Republic. Despite this actual political and social situation in the land of Stalin, Leon Trotsky and his disciples argue that the USSR is still a worker state with a regime of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I guess this is before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, is what I'm guessing here. Because I think Barbarossa was launched in 1941. Yeah, it was launched in 1941, and this was written in, like, I think 1930, or published in, like, the late 1930s. So at this point, the not Hitler-Stalin Pact would have been, I think, God, let me give it a guess here. That's 1939, right? Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was... Come on, let's see. Let's cross our fingers here. 1939, alright, okay, man. Sometimes I feel like I don't remember anything. I forget where I was where I was reading though. What are important are the facts which tell us that as of now and for several years past, the USSR has been coupled to the bourgeois train. In effect, Paris, London, and New York have clearly recognized a state that is an exploiter and oppressor of workers in the so-called Soviet Republic. Despite this actual political and social situation in the land of Stalin, Leon Trotsky and his disciples argue that the USSR is still a worker state with a regime of the dictatorship of the proletariat. They and those who follow such currents of ideas without subscribing to the politics of the Third International are the only ones who interest themselves in their discussions in the nature of the Soviet state, even if they do so in an indirect fashion. We shall therefore polemicize with Trotsky and Trotsky's disciples, since it is in this way that we have fixed in a definite manner our view of the present social nature of the Soviet Republic. It's the end of chapter 1. Thank you so much for listening.